Hello and welcome. I can see we still have some people joining us, but I think I'm going to kind of carry on, and as people kind of come in, we will kind of get going. My name is Ali Fitzgibbon. I'm a senior lecturer here at Queen's University in Belfast, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to one of our kind of last, certainly in the Arts Management and Cultural Policy seminar series for this semester. That's being done jointly with Music Events at Queen's University. I'm delighted to welcome you to, this is loads of different networks, but Cultural Policy Observatory of Ireland, New Reads. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, Cultural Policy Observatory Ireland was established in 2015 to further research and information exchange and cultural policy across the island of Ireland. So one might ask, why are we doing this particular topic today? And I'll get to that. And the New Read series is a new series of online discussions featuring new Irish research or research around the island of Ireland, relevant to the experiences and study of cultural policy on the island. So if you're interested in proposing or hosting a future New Reads event, I'll post a link in the chat. But the CPOI next and final event for 2021 is going to be next Monday, hosted by UCD Art History and Cultural Policy, and featuring a new report on gender accounts in Northern Irish theatre. And this work was completed by Waking the Feminists Northern Ireland and will be presented by the artist and researcher here at Queen's, Maggie Cronin. So as a new strand of research sharing, we're still very much feeling our way, but from our last event discussing the work of Ebon Joseph and her new book on race and racism in Ireland, to today's discussion and a final new read with Maggie on the 29th, we can see there are threads of common interest, a concern as echoed today of how histories, traditions, and norms of practice shape our current practices and policies for arts and culture in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. Tess Slominski's work anticipates renewed calls for equality, diversity and inclusion being reflected across the globe since 2020 and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. But it also raises much earlier, deeper and more important questions for how we reconcile this with assertions of nationhood often born from the protectionist and exclusionary versions of culture. For me, Tessa's work shows how new knowledge emerges from across disciplines. From a study rooted in ethnomusicology and practice, we can draw out important points about the implicit influences on music and the form, the practice, and in the politics and policies of ethno-nationalism. Also, we can see that there are ways that we can use it to open up discussions about the conditions that reinforce inequalities when we examine cultural and creative labor and the conditions diverse artists in all forms face. So today's event, a little bit of housekeeping. We will have, when I introduce Tess, we're going to have Tess speak for around 20 to 25 minutes. And then my wonderful colleague and co-researcher in the School of History, Anthropology, Politics and Philosophy, Yanis Soulakis, is going to chair a Q&A, and we aim to wrap up the whole event by 2:30. So if you require it, we have closed captions, which you can activate by using the little square that says CC at the bottom. We are recording today's talk, which will be posted on the QUB AMCP YouTube channel. If you have any comments, please feel free to use the chat. And if you have questions, please post them through the course of this conversation. Please put them into the Q&A section during the course of this conversation. Spot the person who hasn't learned how to switch off their phone. So I'm delighted to welcome Tess Slominski. While I would love to have her here in person, I praise the shift in technology that has limited our carbon footprint, forced her to set her alarm at an ungodly hour during the Thanksgiving holidays, but also enabled us to have a transatlantic sharing of her ideas and insights. She is a music and sound scholar who studies music, identity and nationalism in Ireland and in its diaspora. And alongside the book she's going to speak about today, Trad Nation, Gender, Sexuality and Race in Irish Traditional Music, she is also the co-editor with Kimberly Francis of the Gender, Sexuality revision of Oxford University Press, Grove Music Online. She served as secretary of the Society for Ethnomusicology's board from 2019 to 2021. And she's currently on the board of the Ward Irish Music Archives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She received her MA in ethnomusicology at the University of Limerick in 2002 and a PhD in music from New York University in 2010. She founded the still thriving Blue Ridge Irish Music Festival in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1999 and taught at Beloit College in Wisconsin from 2012 to 2019. She is currently the Administrative Director of the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School in Charlottesville, Virginia. So Tess, I really welcome you here today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you say, and I'm going to pass it over to you. Many thanks.
Great, thanks, Ali. So first of all, before I start speaking, I'm going to attempt to get rid of my own video, and that seems to not be wanting to happen. So I'll just pretend not to look at myself. So it's great to be here. A week ago today, Karen Casey from Fair Play and Anna Nanulan from the Misa Foster campaign spoke about gender and working conditions in the arts at a joint committee meeting at the Oireachtas. Their remarks reiterated what both groups, as well as Sounding the Feminists, Waking the Feminists, and countless individuals, have been saying for the past few years, if not longer, that sexism and abuse have been problems in the arts in Ireland for a long time, and they continue to be problems despite activist efforts to address them. Furthermore, their presentation noted backlash against women for speaking out. Unfortunately, the situation is not surprising at all. Its historical precedents include backlash in the 1980s to feminist movements in the US, Europe, and other parts of the world, and negative responses to various suffragist movements in the early 20th century. For example, women's suffrage in Ireland took a back seat to the fight for independence in overt and publicly articulated ways. Although women in the Irish Free State were granted equal voting rights in 1922, one might wonder whether the conservatism of the 1930s was in part a backlash to women's activism in the 19-teens in what later became the Republic. In my brief remarks today, I hope to use several teasers from my book, Trad Nation, to demonstrate how cultural policy and history are intricately connected, especially in research and activism that involves marginalized people. I apologize in advance for my focus on policy and case studies from the Republic of Ireland. I simply do not have a sufficient grasp of the interplay of music and cultural policy in Northern Ireland's complicated geographical, political, and cultural position. With that caveat in mind, I think my three main points today will still resonate widely. And because I find talks much easier to follow myself when the speaker offers signposts, I will tell you right now what those three main points are in plain language. First, the past isn't always what we think it was. Second, pay attention to historiography. Third, an exhortation to leave behind some evidence. So first, the past isn't always what we think it was. When I started my PhD in 2004, I was expecting to focus my dissertation on present-day women musicians in Irish traditional music. I thought I would write one chapter of historical background and then spend the rest of the thesis on fieldwork interviews like a good little ethnomusicologist. Because I had been playing Irish traditional music for many years by that point, I thought I had a good knowledge of women musicians of the past, of Julia Clifford, Lucy Farr, Aggie White, Elizabeth Crotty, and others. I thought, I can easily discuss the historical background in one chapter because the real story begins with the generation that includes Mary Bergen, Maeve Donnelly, Liz Carroll, and folks like them. My goodness, I was wrong about that. But probably like most of us in this virtual room, I was brought up in a culture, including an academic culture, that believes that time and progress are both linear. I believe that surely conditions for women musicians in Irish traditional music must be better in 2006 than they were in 1986, and much, much better than they were in 1916. This naive assumption turned out to be correct in some ways, but deeply flawed in others. And my real wake-up call was during the summer of 2005 or 2006 when I visited Nicky McAuliffe in Kerry to see what information he might have on women traditional musicians active before the 1960s. He gave me a list of about a dozen musicians, mostly women Frances O'Neill had profiled in his 1913 book, Irish Minstrels and Musicians. But even the proportionally small number of women musicians in O'Neill's book far exceeded the number of pre-1940s women musicians whose names are routinely remembered in the trad scene, which at the time was almost zero. One of my aims in Trad Nation was to add a few more women's names to the historical record of Irish traditional music, and to amplify and expand collective knowledge about those few women who are already part of the popular history of the genre. But my work is only a tiny fraction of what can and should be done. The archival part of my book focuses on nationally and internationally known women musicians between 1893 and roughly 1923, and left out many women who would have been publicly active in more local contexts. This temporal focus also meant that I only explored a few decades in the lives of women who had much longer careers, including fiddler Teresa Halpin and piper Mae McCarthy, both of whom were active well beyond the heyday of the nationalist era. In my archival research, I found tantalizing suggestions of a very active woman fiddler in Kerry in the 1920s and 30s, and a violinist, Nora O'Hay, who was practically a household name in Dublin in the 19-teens. She doesn't really seem to have many traces elsewhere, but I kind of want to dig into her when I have a chance. But investigating those women was beyond the scope of one short book, especially because I did want to eventually talk about the present day. The dissertation that the book comes out of really was focused on historical stuff, and I wanted to add present day information. It's worth noting here that my primary methodology in archives was to focus on a handful of years and read as many newspapers and other publications as I possibly could, which in reality meant that I focused on Dublin and on papers from the places where I had a sense of local musical histories, so mainly in Munster. I occasionally followed breadcrumb trails into other areas and years. The Leitrim Observer was a treasure trove, as it turned out. And I also did some more targeted research into the 19 trying to put Feshkill fiddle competition winners in a larger context resulted in my identifying the previously mysterious Christina Sheridan and Josephine Whelan from the Shamsa Gael Cayley Band as Bridget Kenny's daughters. Bridget Kenny was known as the Queen of Irish Fiddlers in the 1900s and teens, and she died in 1915. But her daughters had swept the Fesh fiddle competitions in the 19-teens under their maiden name. I had begun to suspect that this was the case based on my archival research, and a chance email encounter with one of Bridget Kenny's great-granddaughters on a genealogy website confirmed my hunch. But it should not have taken me, a scruffy American with a chip on her shoulder, to put these pieces together. These women were tremendous and extremely active musicians in Dublin for decades. Yet the only traces of Christina Sheridan in written Irish music history are Reg Hall's liner notes to the Topic Records compilation Irish Dance Music, and a brief mention of her in the entry in the Companion to Irish Traditional Music in the entry on Tommy Potts. I suspect it is not a coincidence that Christina, Josephine, and several of their siblings were members of a musical matriarchy in a tradition presented as inexorably patriarchal. I could talk all day about archival sleuthing, but here I want us to think about the role of cultural and public policy in shaping what we think we know and what we think to look for. Two pieces of Irish legislation come to mind, both from the 1930s. The Public Dance Halls Act of 1935 and the 1937 Constitution. I believe that both have shaped Irish music practice and historiography in profound and mutually reinforcing ways. I don't have time today to go into all the nuances of these laws, but I've written at length about the former in an article published in the Yearbook of Traditional Music in 2019. By now, the sexism of the Constitution of the Republic of Ireland has been well rehearsed, and I assume everyone here is familiar in some way with the ways that this legislation indicated the, quote, special position of the Catholic Church, asserted that a woman's place was in the home, and barred married women from various kinds of employment. The Public Dance Halls Act may be less familiar outside traditional music circles. It required that anyone who wished to hold a public dance get a license, and was largely an extension of an earlier British law, the Public Health Acts Amendment of 1890. So this was not exactly a new piece of legislation. What differed was the social and cultural context. Because dancing, especially to jazz and popular music, was seen as a moral threat, some clergy pressured police into limiting licenses and enforcing compliance to the letter of the law. This meant that set and ceilidh dances sometimes ran afoul of the law, but enforcement was uneven. The Public Dance Halls Act looms large among traditional music historians, however. in part because well-known musicians like Junior Crean have supplied vivid accounts of its effects in places like West Clare. As I describe in my Yearbook of Traditional Music article, the Public Dance Halls Act's place in the Irish traditional music imagination has meant that private domestic performance has been valorized, rendering early 20th century public performance, especially by women, as less authentic. And all the scare quotes around the word authentic, of course. And in Trad Nation, I describe the effects of the Constitution's restrictions on women. But on a very basic level, these laws shape what we think we know about the women and what we think we know about the Irish, let me start that sentence again. On a very basic level, these laws shape what we think we know about women and what we think we know about Irish traditional music before our own living memories began. For example, if we assume that progress is linear and that the Constitution merely reflected longstanding Irish social mores about women as domestic, we might assume that we'd be wasting our time looking for women musicians in the public record, the assumption I made when I began my research. That assumption turned out to be dead wrong. What else might we be missing because we assume that our ideas are correct about how policy affected people's lives? Second point, pay attention to historiography. My next point is well known to the point of seeming a bit banal, but it's worth making again because it's strangely easy to forget this in the process of research and writing. That is, that histories always reflect the preoccupations and biases of those who write them, and always reflect prevailing notions about the time in which they are written, even if they challenge those notions. This is one of the benefits of thinking historiographically, of engaging with the study of how history is written. Maybe people who write about history's victors don't feel compelled to think too much about historiography, but for those of us who study marginalized populations, it's vital for understanding why people, events, and ideas get left out of the historical record. I remember the moment when I began to really understand the profound influence of a historian's own context on their work. And this was not about Irish music at all. I had just read Ellen Rosen's 1985 article about Monteverdi's opera Poppaea and began wondering whether she would have written the same article if Reaganomics and other US policies of the 1980s had not been such a huge part of the zeitgeist of the time. My own historical context was fully in my mind when I wrote the introduction to Trad Nation in the spring of 2018. I had done much of the research for the book a decade earlier, but researched and wrote the final 2 chapters about present-day marginalized musicians in what felt like a fever dream several months before I turned in the book manuscript. I finished the book and its introduction in downtown Charlottesville, only a few blocks from where the deadly Unite the Right rally in 2017 had transformed Charlottesville into a stage where the world has watched a town confront the violences of white supremacy. I could not have removed myself from this context, even if I had tried. And so I very consciously foregrounded it in Trad Nation. That choice may make the book seem dated in 10 years' time, but I believe it's such an integral part of the work to consider it in its own particular historical moment. It's very easy to focus on the negatives when thinking historiographically, about all the gaps and exclusions. But perhaps the consolation in thinking about a scholar's own historical context is that those contexts can and do change, and sometimes very quickly. I finished the manuscript of Trad Nation in the June of 2018, and it was published in January of 2020. If I were writing the book now, only 3 years later, I would be intervening in a very different cultural and political context, one in which conversations about racism and sexism have advanced significantly both in the US and Ireland, despite plenty of backlash. Conversations about nationalism have also changed, and specifically about what it means to be Irish. The final 2 chapters of Trad Nation began to discuss non-white, non-Irish, and otherwise non-normative musicians in Irish trad, a presence that has been growing for decades, but that has gone largely without scholarly attention or real reflection in the discourse about Irish traditional music, with the exception of Helen O'Shea's monograph, The Making of Irish Traditional Music, and a bit of Mick Maloney's 1980s PhD dissertation where he talks Briefly about non-Irish people in the scene. This absence in the literature and discourse reflects nationalist understandings of Irishness that go back to at least the 18th century. In my book, I discuss intersections between these nationalist understandings and policies and the experiences of women, LGBTQ+ musicians, and musicians of color. For example, one of my Black interlocutors described the collision of Irish immigration policy and traditional music when she was detained for a full day while trying to enter Ireland to begin an MA degree in Irish traditional music. Other musicians and dancers talked about their experiences of inhabiting multiple marginalized categories of identity, the intersectional oppressions of being an Asian woman, for example, and how cultural attitudes reinforced by art sectors across Europe and North America have reinforced the fetishization of Asian women's musicking bodies. Perhaps the most common refrain in all my interviews with non-white musicians was that they are constantly asked to explain their presence in the trad scene. And here it's worth noting that Irish and Scottish melodies have been part of Japanese musical life and music education for over a century, as Sean Williams describes in her 2006 article, Irish Music and the Experience of Nostalgia in Japan. It remains to be seen whether the Irish government's strategy for embracing the affinity diaspora will have any real effects on the experiences of non-Irish and especially non-white traditional musicians. So my third point, leave behind some evidence. One of the methodological lessons I learned in writing Trad Nation was that you just never know what you might find once you start looking, and you never know how seemingly disparate pieces of evidence might eventually fit together. This lesson has practical aspects. I'm big on the practical aspects. For example, how do you collect materials so you can find them again? Are your notes easily searchable? Are they in a computer program that will be supported in a decade when you finally get around to writing that book? That's a lesson I learned the hard way. I also discovered that tracing changes in institutional attitudes and policy over time can be quite tricky, since institutional histories can be brief, fragmentary, unpredictably or infrequently updated, and written with specific agendas in mind, particularly for institutions that depend on donations. Laws and official governmental policy are usually published, which helps with historical research, but the practices and rules of smaller organizations are often much harder to track because archival procedures differ so widely among institutions. In the woefully understaffed and underfunded arts and cultural sector here in the US, archiving organizational materials is often an afterthought. I can speak from experience here because one of my current job duties is to manage my institution's audiovisual archive, and that's a task that usually winds up on the long finger because my other duties are much more pressing. The internet both helps and confounds research on institutions. While more materials are more widely available now than they were in the past, it can be much more difficult to trace changes over time if you don't manage to capture material at a particular moment. Here, the UNESCO website is a great example. One of my backburnered projects has been to trace the development of UNESCO's thinking about intangible heritage since it published the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Heritage in 2003. But UNESCO's website is labyrinthine at the best of times and confounds even the most diligent attempts to leave trails of electronic breadcrumbs to specific information. Because it is the internet's nature to be simultaneously and seemingly unpredictably permanent and ephemeral, my present self wishes that my previous self had taken screenshots at least twice a year since I conceived of this project in 2006. Sites like the Wayback Machine help, but the sheer volume of information on the internet can be as difficult to navigate as physical archives. My chapter on fiddler and dancer Teresa Halpin illustrates another way that policy affects the evidence that we find. Halpin was an integral part of the Gaelic League and Cultus Celtori Éireann, and while she is more present in CCE archival material, her contributions to Irish traditional music and dance overall are obscured by gender and language politics. Like Christina Kenny Sheridan and Josephine Kenny Whelan, Teresa Halpin was known for most of her life by her married name, O'Careen, a patriarchal naming system encoded in both law and social practice. Combined with her extensive participation in Irish language revitalization efforts, which frequently, but not always, led her to use the Irish versions of her first maiden and or married names, this confusion around naming has denied her the recognition her activities warrant. So I have a lot of takeaways here, but I will finish this section with this exhortation. As you do your own research and work, be conscious of what evidence you might like to leave behind and where you should consider leaving that evidence so other people can find it. In some cases, that might mean putting institutional archiving on your organization's agenda or giving it greater priority. In other cases, it might mean finding a volunteer to organize and catalog what has already been saved. And for those of us who have had a few decades to amass our own archives, well, we should be thinking about we should be thinking about organization cataloging and possibly making plans to donate materials to relevant archives where others might be able to make use of them. Of course, I hasten to add that I have not yet managed to make sense of my boxes of cassette tapes of session and concert recordings from the 1990s. So, conclusion. In my musings today about the intersections of cultural policy, history, and music in my work, I've tried to give you something of a behind-the-scenes tour of Trad Nation, including a few teasers if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. I'm grateful to Ali, Giannis, and Tori, and to Cultural Policy Observatory Ireland to have given me this opportunity to think with you all today about methodology, which is something of a preoccupation of mine. And I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this test. This was a wonderful presentation. I know it's very early where you are, so we deeply appreciate the lucidity as well of it all. So thank you very much for this. We're going to open to discussion. I'm going to be tracking comments that I understand are arriving to different places, but I'll do my best. I might kick off, take advantage of my position as chair and kick off with the first one. Obviously, a lot of your work, both in the book, but what you present here as well, creates this dialogue between archives and current practice. And I know that recently you've moved from kind of being an academic educator to working in the archives kind of space. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what this move entails for you and how all this research feeds into what you're doing right now?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that actually. Full disclosure, I planted that question with Giannis. So I believe in showing the scaffolding when the scaffolding is useful. And this, so I'm going to go on at some length here because this is part of, this is material I did not have time to talk about in the prepared or in the officially prepared part of the talk. So my current job, well, so I left my job as a professor. I left the tenure track in 2019, and I did so for multiple reasons that I'm happy to go into some of at some other point. And after some soul searching and also the, just trying to figure out what jobs might be available to me, what I might be able to do in the context of wanting to move back to Charlottesville. This is home for me. I got a job at Rare Book School, and Rare Book School is an organization, a nonprofit that's dedicated to supporting the study of book history and the material book. And so there are a lot of sort of obvious resonances there. My actual role is administering a fellowship for junior scholars. And so in that job, I do a mixture of strategic thinking, budget management, and other big picture stuff alongside a lot of more mundane administrative tasks. And I say this, I'm making a point about this because it'll come up in a second. And I also help with the school's communications work. So social media presence and the archiving is part of that. So it's an interesting shift, but I'm finding that I'm using a lot of the skills that I developed as a researcher, particularly how to find my way around data has been very, very useful. And then a lot of the people skills gained in teaching. So if there are any students out there, which I understand that there probably are, think about what you're learning see if you can zoom out and think about what you're learning, because you never know what's going to come in handy. It's like archival research. You never know what you're going to say, oh my gosh, that's so meaningful. I had no idea 5 years ago that was going to be so meaningful. But I think the most important thing that I brought with me, and this comes from long before I even started graduate school, was but my studies and my research and the times we live in have really intensified this, is my desire to make the world a better place, especially for people who are marginalized in some way. So I identify as both non-binary and lesbian, which is sometimes a little confounding to people, and I come from a working class background. And so that I feel has put me in a particularly different position sometimes. And thanks to a couple of my high school teachers, actually, so this goes way back, they were very keen on making sure that we were exposed to information, history, and literature from the civil rights movement of the 1960s. This was very unusual for the time and place I grew up in, which was the 1980s in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is the town, for those, I'm sure probably nobody in the audience is familiar with this town, but the Bible Belt. Jerry Falwell, the big televangelist, that's where he has his ministries. It is an extremely, extremely conservative and very, in many ways, very segregated town. So it was kind of unusual that I had teachers in high school who were insistent that I read the autobiography of Malcolm X and things like that. So that's been in my sort of on my horizon for a long time, which of course does not mean that I have not failed many, many, many times in living those ideals, and that the amount of white fragility that I carry and try to deal with is tremendous. And so why am I saying all this? This might seem like, whoa, why is she telling me all this stuff about her life and all these private details? And what is going on with that? But it's all part of a backdrop of what I'm coming to realize. In recent years, I've become very weary and wary of performative activism, and by golly, not being performatively activist is kind of hard to avoid sometimes, especially when you have like a public platform. Like, how do you not be that person who is being very performative about your activism? But what the current role has done, I think, in a way that teaching also did, but maybe to a less obvious extent, is to just drive home to me what small acts, the importance of small acts, and where small administrative changes can actually have profound follow-on effects. And so I think about this in my current job, which is why I planted the question with Giannis. So, in my day job, I'm doing so much of what I like to call administrivia, the mundane details, trying to take care of the mundane details. Did so-and-so fill out the form they needed to fill out, that kind of thing. And what I've learned in this work, and then also in my service work, particularly on the board of the Society for Ethnomusicology, is that administrative and bureaucratic structures are really static. They don't want to change. They're very difficult to change. And they're often white supremacist, and in ways that they don't realize that they are. And I'm sort of personifying the structures, which is a little, I kind of don't want to do that, because it's the people who drive the structures. And so I've watched, and I've been this person who says, well, yeah, of course, I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-sexist, I'm anti-heterosexist. And then we wind up upholding these white supremacist and other supremacist administrative status quo and these structures, because we don't have the power to change them. We don't have the wherewithal to change them. We don't have time to zoom out and say, wait a minute, what does this bit in the bylaws or whatever, what is this administrative procedure, what barrier does this put up that we don't see, because we are just so involved in trying to get the work done. We're so understaffed, we're so overwhelmed, whatever, we just need to get the work done. We don't have time to zoom out and say, whoa, wait a minute, that doesn't have to be that way. And then of course the problem gets compounded by funding structures that sometimes are themselves requiring procedures. Yes, I took notes on my own question. I'm that person. So, you know, and I think here, when we think about racism, there's so many, and I know that it's like, how did she leap from what she was talking about archival methodologies and white women musicians to racism? These are all together. These are all problems that feed into each other. Racism, sexism, heterosexism. And the book goes into that quite a bit about how they all fit together. But I've been thinking in my administrative work that thinking of, and here's another leap, but it makes sense, that disability and accessibility are a really useful litmus test, because they don't necessarily have the same kind of, people don't suddenly tense up in the same way that we white people tend to do when we talk about race. Anybody can become disabled at any time. And so there is, I think that there are fewer barriers to thinking about that. And so I'm starting to realize that that's a useful litmus test for thinking about organizational willingness to change structures that are providing barriers across a range of identities. But just, you know, is an institution willing to put resources into becoming accessible? Are those resources short-term? Is there a quick fix because you have a blind student in your class, and so you've got to scrounge to, you know, put something together to help that student do what they're going to do? Or is your institution thinking, okay, well, we have a blind student now. Next year, we might have a deaf student. We might have people with, you know, mobility issues. Are we going to put resources in right now to change and work toward solving all of those things, or at least improving all of those things? And so I feel like that's kind of a litmus test, and that's a place where people can often intervene. I am really rabbiting on, so I apologize for being like, but I'm going to keep doing it for a second. So Giannis, bear with me. And yeah. So as I think about this, and I think, well, what can people do? Because there's still, you know, structural change is overwhelming. It's, you know, you kind of want to do the big thing that's going to fix everything. And I'm increasingly thinking that that is not possible. So I spent a little bit of time thinking about, well, okay, what can people do? Because that's a question that I would want answered. And so I've thought a lot about finding and using your superpower, figuring out what your superpower is, and figuring out what the superpowers are of the people around you, and helping them develop and use their superpowers. So for example, I like to think that one of my superpowers is being able to see how details fit into a big picture. And so right now in my day job, I'm reworking some really boring forms that people have to fill out to make them more transparent, more sensible, so that people know why they're filling out the form and what it's going to do for them. I'm increasing the amount of paperwork that people have to do by a little bit. I'm decreasing it in other ways, but I'm increasing it in one way because I realized that, you know, here's a little bit of effort that can give a tremendous amount of benefit to people who fill out this form. So, but those aren't the only superpowers. You know, some people have the superpower of being able to talk to donors. I really do not have that superpower. I'm pretty bad at talking to older white men who are in power. I'm kind of bad at that. So, you know, it's best to leave that to somebody else. Another superpower is bringing people together. Another one is being able to hold space for people to change their minds. And that's a huge one, you know, making space for people to deal with their own things like white fragility or whatever. So that is a very, very, very long-winded answer to the question that I made you ask me, Giannis. So now I hope that other people will ask me questions so that I can get put on the spot a little bit.
Thank you so much, Tess. And, you know, yes, the question was to some extent planted, but it wasn't a question that I wasn't going to ask anyway. So great to hear all your thoughts. I do have follow-up questions, but there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to move to those. So firstly, from our colleague here at Queen's, Paul Stapleton, who asks, Have you come across Una Monaghan's 2021 article, 121 Stories, the Impact of Gender on Participation in Irish Traditional Music, which appeared in Ethnomusicology Ireland, and it references your work and reports on a study conducted in 2018 involving 121 anonymous responses gathered from an online open call for experience relating to gender in an Irish traditional context. If you have read this article, I would be interested to hear your thoughts. If you haven't come across this text, it's definitely worth a read, and Paul has shared the link for that article as well. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I know that article well. I used it extensively in a piece that I just wrote for an edited volume that Laura Watson and Jenny O'Connor and Ida Bosong are putting together on women in music in Ireland. And I wish so much that Una had done that study and that I had known about it when I was working on my work. It's one of those things where, it's like the chicken or the egg thing. Can, what happens in what order, but that is such important work. It's work that I would like to have been able to do myself, but I was not the right person to do that work, and she is. So I love that article. I would like to see an expansion of that. There's a lot that she's condensing to fit it into that small Ethnomusicology Ireland article, and I know that there's a ton more. So I'm hoping that she does something where and I know that there are all kinds of confidentiality issues around publishing a lot of the material from those interviews, or from those, it was a survey, I guess, right? But yeah, that tremendous work. And I'm floored, reading that whole Ethnomusicology Ireland volume and thinking about the work that's been done just since I really put my nose to the grindstone and started working on the book, which it got backburnered for many years, and I didn't really sit down actually until I had a sabbatical in 2018. So I did a lot of work in a really, really short amount of time there. But even what was happening then and what's happened since, it really puts Irish traditional music scholarship in a completely different place than it was certainly when I started my work in the 2000s, but even when I started really working on the book in 2018.
Thanks very much, Tess. The next question from Michael Collier, who is asking more of a practical question. And he says, do you know or have an online or software system for cataloging music? Because he'd like to use it for cataloging CDs, tapes, and so on. So what would you recommend there?
I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't have an answer for myself yet. I would love to say that I will remember to get back to you when I have an answer, but maybe shoot me an email. I'll stick let's see, if I put things in the chat, people can see that, right? I'll put my email in the chat. So anybody who would like to email, yeah, and remind me, because I need to find that for myself and my plan. So forgive a little bit of a shameless plug for my current employer, but Rare Book School, really its main bread and butter is offering classes, summer classes that are usually about a week long. And there are a range of things, from how to understand, early modern English handwriting to, courses on finding the provenance of different books and, all kinds of book history things. One of the classes they offer is an audiovisual archives management class. And one of the perks of my job is that I get to take a class for free. So that is my plan. I might not have an answer for your question until next summer after that course, but let me get back to you. I guess all I can say there. Right now, my system is on paper. It's quirky and it's my own, because it's the thing that I sort of developed way back before I had any encounters with any kind of archival practice.
Thanks, Tess. Another question that also verges on the practical here is from John Mackle, who asks, what go-to archive sources would you recommend to start exploring or finding any left behind evidence, particularly in discovering non-white and non-Irish artists that you refer to?
So a lot of the work for for musicians of color, and that has been very. I'm getting distracted by the chat happening here.
I'll follow the chat. Don't worry about it.
Okay, there has been there hasn't. Here I'm going to get myself. I'm talking myself into a corner because I just told y'all not to assume what you are and aren't going to find in an archive. Having said that, I have found very little archival evidence of non-white musicians, and the Irish trad scene, of course, is very much a word of mouth thing, and so I actually didn't really try very hard to find, because I knew that I didn't have time to go through and to look at newspapers from the years when there, for example, when there were large amounts of immigration into Britain from the of Afro-Caribbeans. I might have gone, if I'd had more time to do that, and if I had focused more on London beyond the life of Julia Clifford and some stuff about Lucy Farr, I probably really would have started trying to look at stuff around Afro-Caribbean immigration into Britain. That would be one little angle that I would kind of get in there to start trying to pick out. But, this is, I focused on the ethnographic stuff because it was actually the easiest thing for me to do. The word of mouth, all the people that I knew exactly, in a lot of cases, I knew exactly who I wanted to talk to. And I always asked, hey, is there anybody, can you think of anybody else that I might not know that I should talk to? But, I've been in the scene for a long time, so I kind of knew who I wanted to talk to. But one methodology that I didn't really make much use of that I think would have added some interesting facets to the project would be looking in photo archives and really just paying attention to the visual information to see what seems to be there, or possibly even what seems not to be there. Are there places where we can locate, for example, Asian musicians who play Irish trad? If we know, for example, that, and I don't know how many tradies are in the audience, but if we know, for example, that Patty and Bridget, the well-known Japanese Irish musicians, were at a festival, can we find evidence, photographic evidence of that festival, and do they appear in it? So thinking about not just what's there and how to find it, but thinking about what maybe should be there, and is it there? And maybe it is, and maybe it's not. And to think about it in that way. So that's a rather oblique answer to your question. My methodology has always been to just kind of start looking and see what's there, and then draw, excuse me, and then draw my conclusions from what I'm finding. Because I find, looking for women musicians sometimes is like a needle in a haystack. And musicians of color, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Musicians of color even more so. And then when you add LGBTQ musicians into the mix with the power of the closet, that becomes, in fact, that was a very tricky part of this research. I would have loved to have found airtight evidence that was okay to share about queer musicians from previous generations. And that evidence is, I've had conversations with people about specific musicians, but not in ways that I would ever put into print. I almost think that in some ways talking about the speculations about certain musicians is very interesting, but again, I'm not going to do that because there are speculations, and some pretty damaging ones at that. And so that's one reason that I've also been very careful to only use my own experience and the experience of people who've given me their permission, because that's a whole other kettle of fish there.
That's a very thoughtful answer, Tess. Thanks very much. A question from May Ramsey, who actually echoes one of the questions that I wanted to ask as well, so that's great. She says, I'm planning to write about experiences of women within both trad and non-trad music scenes in Northern Ireland specifically. And you mentioned the Misa Foster Me Too movement within the sphere. I'd be interested in hearing any general insights or thoughts you have around this movement in the Irish trad scene. And what I wanted to add to this, because that was also my question, is what do you think the role of your work is in kind of shaping that movement? Because I'd say it's quite big.
So I think, I mean, it's weird to say that something where people talk about the terrible experiences they've had, it's very weird to say that's great. I'm really glad it's happening. I'm really sad that it has to happen. And I also think that it, you know, I laud everybody for the bravery of going into very public spaces like Twitter and talking about experience. That is, it's very powerful. And so, you know, general thoughts about, oh, did it go? Oh no, it went away. The question went away. Oh, answered. Okay, I'm going back to it.
Sorry, that was my fault.
No worries, no worries.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I think it's only ever going to be good in the long term. Although I do worry as a person sometimes about the people who are sharing information and whether there are, you know, the hope, but the knowledge that often people don't necessarily get the kind of support that they need around talking about things like sexual harassment and abuse. But Giannis, you were asking about, excuse me, losing my voice again. You were asking me about my influence on this, and I had a thought about that. Now, what was it? One of the things that I've tried very hard to do, and I've tried, this is something that comes from having something of a devil may care attitude professionally. By 2018, I didn't know what I was going to do with my career. I had begun having thoughts about leaving the academy. And I had also had the experience of coming out in the Irish scene in the, you know, right around 2005, I think. I was a late bloomer. And it took me many years to come out. And I was afraid in my 20s that if I came out in the Irish trad scene, that people would say, nope, nope, we're tossing you out. You don't get to be here anymore. We don't want you here. And it turned out that when I did finally come out, which took me having the support of people outside the scene and a few people inside the scene, I did it from a place of security. I did it from a place of knowing that I had friends who would still play tunes with me, that I had tons of friends outside the scene. And so it took that for me to come out. As it turns out, that's been mostly a fine experience. It was, you know, my fears were really quite unfounded in many ways. The harassment that I've experienced has been around gender rather than sexuality for the most part. And yeah, I have some Me Too stories too. Yeah, so I've been trying, I've since then, and this sort of devil may care professional attitude, I've tried very hard to be very open about my stuff. And I would like to think that openness comes out in the book. And I would like to think that openness, which includes leaving academia, you know, that's something that is also something that people tend to be a little more closeted about or a little more quiet about. I've been kind of shouting it from the rooftops. And not necessarily because I want to overshare or that I want to be a loud voice in that, but because I keep hearing that it helps other people make sense of their own experiences. So that's a very, very long-winded way. This is what happens when you get me first thing in the morning, is that I'm just like, verbal filters off. You know, that I have tried hard to be open in those ways to help others feel that they can become open. So that's something that I hope that the work has done.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Tess. I think the openness in the book is quite evident, and you do share some of those stories. And it's, I mean, again, it's not great that you've gone through them, but it's great that we're able to read about them in a critical way. So that is absolutely great. And I think your story also of leaving academia is a lot more useful than other stories of people leaving academia that we've seen, especially music academia recently. So, you know, there's productive and unproductive stories in that space. So it's good to hear the productive ones. A question from Ali, who says, could you talk a little bit more about your work connecting the development of Irish trad as a form and Irish ethno-nationalism? How do the two of them sort of connect?
Okay, so I'm looking at the chat now, and I'm laughing at the good old autocorrect. I'm always yes in autocorrect. So that my motivation there has actually been very selfish. As a non-Irish person, you know, I probably, like, genetically, if I did a DNA test, probably some Irish would come out, because, like, I'm white as white, like, I don't know, probably I'm American, like, probably. But my last name is very Polish, obviously. And I have, you know, for many, many years, still people are like, Slominski, are you one of the Slominskis of Cavan? You know, I've heard that so many, like, it's always Cavan. Why is it always Cavan? And so that whole thing of having to explain my presence, which I did not have to do nearly as much as my non-white compatriots, but having to explain, well, what's a Polish American, you know, and I don't even have any connection to my Polish ancestry, so, like, that's even that adds a little bit of hilarity to it too. But I had to explain myself so many times. It got me to really thinking, and I had, you know, concert organizers and festival organizers would say, well, you know, American festival organizers would say, well, we want somebody who's really Irish. We want somebody with an Irish accent. We want somebody who can tell stories about Ireland. I'm like, well, hell, I got stories about Ireland, but you don't want to hear those, evidently. And so my thinking about ethno-nationalism actually came out of my own experience of trying to make sense of, for one thing, who am I? Why am I here? What is it about this music that has, where I have dedicated at this point nearly 30 years to this music? What is it about it that makes me want to do that? And that's been a lot. That has led to a lot of interesting thoughts, and some of those come out in the book. But then also, how do I make sense of how people are responding to me? And how do I make sense of the ethnic heritage thing? How do I make sense of experiences in the immigration office in Limerick, sailing through easily as, at the time, somebody who appeared to be very gender normative, young white American, compared with the Nigerian women who were also in the immigration office at the same time? You know, how do I make sense of that? So how do I make sense of the fact that my first full summer in Ireland in 1998, I didn't realize that I hadn't seen a Black person in months until I saw a woman in Ennis walking around with her shopping. And I was like, wait, I hadn't realized that I hadn't seen anybody who wasn't white in a long time. And so, you know, and then watching as Ireland becomes more and more diverse and struggles with becoming more and more diverse. So there are a lot of ingredients that got me into that line of thinking.
That is all really fascinating. Thanks very much, Tess. I'm quite conscious of the time that is running out, and I'm going to revert back to Ali, who's going to give a bit of a closure. But from my perspective, thanks so much, Tess. It was fantastic.
Well, thank you all so much too. And thanks for the great questions. These are the best questions I've gotten in a while. So thanks, y'all.
Good. Thank you so much. So this is just the kind of rounding up. I'm conscious of the time as well. So I would like at this point just to say a big warm thank you to our guest speaker, Tess Slominski. We are really delighted you've joined us. That was a really great discussion, really great talk. hopefully more to come and more opportunities to share thoughts and research. I particularly like administrivia and the idea of small acts being greater than performative kind of gestures. I just kind of like to, and I'd also like to thank Giannis, who was an able and insightful chair. I would just like to very quickly share to the chat the link to our next event, which is next Monday. It's coming up really quickly. And there is an Eventbrite link. This one is being hosted by our colleague, Victoria Dure, who was one of the co-founders of the Cultural Policy Observatory Ireland, who sadly couldn't be with us today, but she's going to be hosting this event next Monday, and you get to hear me again because I will be in the chair's seat. Just to remind anybody, if you are interested, we are very keen to kind of hear more. There's a question about finding the link. Tess is going to find the link when I post it. If anybody is interested in signing up to the Cultural Policy Observatory Ireland mailing list, then I'm just going to post that link too. When we talk about cultural policy, we talk about lots of different things. I hope Tess gave you a flavour of what that might be. And also just to say that as we've been recording this talk, it will appear on the Queen's Arts Management and Cultural Policy YouTube channel, which is our new toy in which we share these kinds of insights and information. So look forward to hearing from you, and please keep in touch with us. Thanks again, everybody.